I want to welcome you to this screencast of Beda Fomm. My name is John Kranz with Consim Press, and we're going to be focusing on movement and also touching upon the stacking rules, which play such a critical role to keep in mind during the movement phase, as well as some special rules for the Italian player, especially regarding handling of Italian transport units. So let's go ahead and get started. As you probably know already, the last value on the unit counters is their movement allowance or movement factor. And in some cases we have underlined values, which means they're capable of doing infiltration movement, which is basically starting the movement phase in an enemy zone of control and being able to then move into an adjacent hex that's also in the zone of control of an enemy unit, as I just showed you there with the Italian infantry battalion. Also, you'll notice that some of the Italian units in green have a white circle behind their movement allowance, for example the transport unit and the artillery unit here. And if we scroll on over to the movement track, the all-important movement track, you'll notice here that for the Italian player specifically, that all units that have that white circle behind their movement factor, which again is meant to be a mnemonic aid for play, that white circle is meant to remind you to use the column here with the white background. And really what it's trying to tell you is these units are stuck with sticking to the roads or trails for any type of movement. So any Italian unit that has a white circle background, as you can see here, some of the unit symbols, they're only going to be able to move or retreat along roads or along the trails. You'll see they're prohibited from entering clear undulating terrain. So let's go back to our situation here on map. So let me go ahead and position the units again. And here we go. And we're going to focus on some examples of movement. Again, let's pretend it's the Italian player's turn. One thing to keep in mind is stacking rules are always in effect during all points of movement and retreat. That's really critical for the Italian player. If you recall in the game, we have more or less what's called a four-point stacking rule. The battalion size units, which are the units I'm highlighting here, they have also another white background. In this case, the white background is literally behind the unit size box. So you can see here where my arrow is, my pointer, that we have a white background just behind the battalion unit size symbol. This again is another mnemonic aid in the game to let you know, remind players that you can only have one such unit stacked in a hex. And when I said earlier about the 4-point rule, that was basically treat battalions as a 3-point value unit. So here we have an infantry battalion, count that as 3 points. Any other smaller unit type is 1 point. So here we have an armored unit counting as 1. That's a total of 4 points. That is actually the maximum stacking in the game is 4 points. So this battalion's worth 3. The tank unit is worth 1. That's your max stacking, and you can never exceed those stacking limits any time during play. So again, just something to keep in mind. So one thing the Italian player is going to want to do is be very wary and alert to these stacking rules during movement of units during play. So I'm going to go ahead and start a typical Italian movement phase. Let's talk about Italian transport units for a second. You notice we have a transport unit right here, sitting in the middle of the road network. Again, it's a battalion-sized unit for stacking purposes. That means this Sabratha infantry division cannot move or enter this hex, as I've shown you here, because that's exceeding the stacking limit, because that's 2 battalion-sized units in a hex, and that is not permissible. So one thing the Italian player can do at the very beginning of the turn is to decide if he wants to park any of his transport units. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to go ahead and flip over this transport unit. Notice now that it's flipped over as a parking symbol, meaning it can't move. And also the unit size symbol box, instead of a white highlight, as in the artillery unit here I'm showing, notice it has a yellow background instead of white. That's a mnemonic aid to help remind players that when an Italian transport unit parks, it's actually parked away from the road in this case. And it does not count at all towards stacking purposes. You can have 1 parked unit per hex and basically treat it as a 0. You can disregard it completely for stacking. So that was an important decision to make at the beginning of this movement phase for the Italian player, because we do want to go ahead and advance some of the units we have through that hex. So I'm going to go ahead and make this area a little bit bigger here so we can see that. So for example, I can take this armor unit that I want to bring along the road network, and I can advance it over the infantry battalion because that's a total of 4 stacking points. I can do that. I can also obviously move it here over the transport unit. That's again a total of 4. And then I can move it here on top of this artillery unit. Notice I can't move it into this final hex here because, again, due to stacking limits, I would be exceeding the stacking limit of 4 points, which is 1 battalion and 1 smaller unit. So that would be my max movement there. Since I've got this transport unit parked here, I could actually advance now my infantry unit into this hex because, again, the transport unit does not count for stacking purposes. Of course, that means I could not unpark the Italian transport because that would make it count for stacking, and then I'd be overstacked. So this is a move that is now permissible so long as, again, the transport unit's parked. Now, one thing I really want to do is get this artillery unit, which has a barrage factor. It's the middle value of 6. I really want to get it moving along down the road. Notice the white circle movement factor means it can only move along a road. I can't take it off road, off the network. But again, I've got some stacking problems here. I've got this, I've got an airborne unit here that's in the way. That's a battalion, and I can't move through this hex at all because of stacking limits. And as a matter of fact, I can't move the. I'd have to move this unit first, basically, is what I'd want to do. So let's assume I went ahead and moved this unit. So I'm going to go ahead and move it here just off the road for a second. Again, this unit does not have a white circle, so I could move it off the road. That's no problem at all, even into this zone of control if I wanted an infantry unit. I can now advance this Italian artillery unit, but I'm afraid that's the farthest I can bring this unit down the road network due to the stacking rules here. Here I've got 3 stacking points with the infantry battalion, but again I've got a battalion-sized unit again, and that would be too much for stacking purposes. So my artillery is basically stuck on this road network behind all these other units. Basically, as you're moving units, you can move units as stacks of units, and then if you're moving a stack, you can drop off units as you go. So I could move the stack together, and then I could drop off the infantry and keep moving the armor if I so desire to do that. So that, again, is an example of movement. One thing to keep in mind also as far as special rules is, let's say I want to advance just the infantry battalion here. I cannot advance into this hex because I'm entering an enemy armor zone of control, and infantry personnel type units cannot enter an enemy zone of control of a tank or armored type unit, so that would not be allowed. The solution to this problem would be if I move these units as a stack. As long as the infantry is moving along with a friendly armor unit, it can then enter the enemy armor zone of control. So that is a permissible move right there. Another option would have been if the armor unit moved by itself first, and then I could go ahead and also move the infantry unit in. That is a eligible move I can make. Let's look at some other examples of movement. We'll talk about infiltration movement for the Italian player. We've got an underlying value of 8 here. That means I can conduct infiltration movement and basically move from Zoc to Zoc, enemy Zoc to Zoc, but then I must stop my movement and I'm done for the turn. Please note that this is an infantry unit, so if, for example, the British player had moved up this armored car into this hex, or let's do a different example, we'll move the armored car into this hex here, I would not be able to conduct infiltration movement into this hex anymore because, again, I'm entering that enemy armor zone of control, so that would not be a permissible move. I would have to first, for example, perhaps move this armor into this hex, and then I could go ahead and do an infiltration movement such as that. So again, that's just a quick example of movement in the game. As you can see, the stacking rules are very important. They're in effect at all times during play for movement purposes. So you really also want to think about your Italian transport units, whether they're going to be parking or not. If they park, they don't count for stacking, so that's critical in the game as well. We've seen infiltration unit capabilities with the underlying movement values, where in some cases we can do infiltration movement, but you do have to be careful again with those personnel units not entering by themselves an enemy armor zone of control. And that is the movement rules in a nutshell in Beda Fomm. I hope you found this helpful. If you have any movement questions or any other rules questions about the game, you can reach us at consimpress.com, or you can also reach us at bedafomm.com. Thank you for listening.